So hello, welcome to CapYear Cast. CapYear is a gap year program that's meant to maximize your clinical experience during your gap year, trying to place you in healthcare centered locations so that you can learn a little bit about what it's like to be a doctor. And today we're switching things up. Instead of our usual host, John Walkup, it's going to be me, Deb Gutman. I'm one of the strategic advisors and lead educators for the CapYear program. And today I'm going to be talking to Joon Kim. Joon Kim is the president-elect of NAAHP, and he is also the senior director and instructor of the postbac program at Keck Graduate Insitute, which is part of the Claremont Colleges in California. Hi, Joon. How you doing?
Hey, Deb, I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me.
And so today I was hoping we could talk a little bit about how best to resource your pre-health advisors. NAHP, maybe you could actually kind of start us off there in terms of what that stands for, who they are, what the organization is about.
Sure. Absolutely. So it's NAAHP. So there's two A's in there. And so the acronym stands for National Association for the Advisors in the Health Professions. It's quite a mouthful, but that is the acronym for our association. And the association was founded consisting of pre-health advisors that work with undergraduate students to sort of navigate that very complex world of health careers. I think most students are familiar with becoming a physician, but really our association is really geared to help students discover all the different health professions like dentistry and pharmacy and so forth. There are so many more that's available than students are aware. And so our association is an association for the advisors. But very frequently, whether it's the different projects we're working on or some of the priorities, it's very, very easy and very common for our members to get kind of sidetracked and thinking about students because we love students. I mean, what educators don't love the students? But really, our association is aimed to provide the resources and the training and the professional development for the advisors to do a great job so then they can service their students.
Now, interestingly enough, I work as an independent educational consultant, and that is how Joon and I crossed paths years ago. I actually had to go back and look it up, but it was actually 2014 where we met as seatmates on a bus going to tour Stanford Medical School and hear more about the med school program so that we could become better pre-health advisors. Since then, I also entered the postbac world and am working as an instructor at the Brown Postbac Gateways program, which is a master's in medical sciences program. And so both of us have done sort of this pre-health advising for a while. Tell me a little bit about how you got into pre-health advising and how long you've been doing it.
Sure. Oh man, this is going to be very therapeutic for me. I mean, it's I got into pre-health advising sort of kind of by accident. I mean, I was a teacher first and foremost. I was teaching middle school science. And I myself, when I was a little college student, thought I wanted to go into medicine. And so, while I certainly knew about the world of pre-med and all that it entails, I really didn't think about, I'm going to be a pre-health advisor so I could help students like myself back when, so they can, obviously be successful. So I actually just started as a biology advisor. That was my very first higher ed job. And it was to sort of work with students in the biology department at the University of Southern California to help them make sure they're on schedule to graduate, making sure that, they have all the requirements. And if they wanted to double major or triple minor, that I would be able to help support that. And somewhere along the way, I mean, what happens naturally is when you are working with bio majors or pretty much any natural science majors, there's a good proportion of those students that are pre-med. So that's where I just sort of on my own kind of started reading up on and explored what it means to be a specific pre-health advisor as opposed to more of a general academic advisor. And so 2000 and I would say about seven is when I really sort of delved fully into the world of pre-health advising, got involved with NAAHP as well, and really learned about all the sort of important details that make pre-health advising different and unique from generalized advising. And the way you stay up to date on all that information really is to speak to people, visiting schools. You had mentioned, taking a campus tour. That is certainly an important component of that as well. And so, yeah, I've been working with pre-health students for now, what is that, 17, 15 years, 15,
Yep.
16 years specifically. Yep.
And so what would you say? So a lot of the students who are participating in the CapYear program are students taking a gap year, mostly to get additional clinical experience that they can
Sure.
use when they apply to pre-health programs. How would you say they should best resource their pre-health advisors from their schools?
Yes, so this will vary. And so this is one of those things that I think back when we were going to school, we just went with what's the best school. But I think the students and parents, the families are a lot more savvy about what's important. So obviously your question is going right to the heart of that question is, when you consider a program, when you consider the college that you want to attend, there is some real differences in terms of what you can expect in terms of pre-health advising. So that advising, you also have to understand, is maybe for some that are not familiar, advising is so much more when done correctly to be so much more than information dissemination. If you're truly just interested in getting facts, deadlines, and just sort of these very concrete knowledge, students are very savvy. They can access all that information online, but a real seasoned and experienced advisor, they'll provide so much more. They are in many ways kind of like a counselor, almost a therapist at times, because to be pre-med, it is a very difficult journey. And so I think this clinical experience thing, I always, advise my students, listen, this process that you're embarking on, first and foremost, you need to figure who you are, right? Before you can help others, because very often when you ask pre-medical students, um, their motivation for going into it is because they want to help people. Well, just as many colleagues and I'm sure you have heard this too, Deb, when you're on the airplane, and they're going over the emergency procedure, they'll tell you, put the oxygen mask on yourself before you help anybody else out. And that very much holds true also in the world of healthcare services, where you need to make sure you're well so then you can help others. So in that very similar way, when you are a pre-health student, you need to really know who you are, not just because it's going to be helpful for the admission process, but I argue that is actually more important than knocking out those checklist items.
Right.
So, right? I mean, we hear students these days now, oh, I'm going to take a gap year. Oh, that's great. That's great that you're planning a gap year. Why?
Right. What are you
And
going to do?
sometimes that's right. And some students will say, oh, because I need to improve my GPA, or I
I
need
need
to
to
do some
study for the
research.
MCAT. Yes.
That's exactly. That's probably I would say that's like number one or two. I would
Yep.
definitely say that is your top two answers, is I got to study for my MCAT. But really, what students should understand is the admission process and being successful to gain acceptance into medical school, or for that matter, any health graduate program, is so much more than just meeting an academic threshold. I mean, it really, because if you think about it, and I know a lot of students who might be listening know of some other friends and people that they know who had amazing academic stats. Their accolades and achievements were very impressive. They might have hundreds and maybe even thousands of hours of research experience, and yet they still did not get a single acceptance. How is that possible?
Yeah.
Students would be thinking. Well, that's because the process doesn't work the way you think it works. And the way that you're going to really put yourself in the best position to be successful is to take some time to figure out who you are, what are your interests, what truly are your strengths, and also where are some areas that you really need to work on before you go off to something as important and a big undertaking as going off to med school.
Right. And so, it's funny because when I think about, and I agree 100%. And when I talk about clinical experience during your gap year, I always tell students it's about professional identity formation. Those are big buzzwords, but it is really about figuring out, is this the profession for me? What does this profession look like? And really kind of trying it on for size before you commit yourself to this whole process of becoming a physician and residency and, years of practice. So I wanted to divert back to just kind of highlighting NAHP in some ways, because I was surprised that there is this resource for pre-health advisors. So, I think it's helpful for students to know that they're not just operating in a vacuum. They really do have a peer kind of support group of other advisors where they can get a really, even the newer advisors can get a really kind of diverse experience of what's going on in the advising world and really have resources and support available to them through NAHP. Like you said, like we did those school tours on a conference way back when, like now 8, 9 years ago. And so how does NAHP support kind of college pre-health advisors?
Yeah. So I want to backpedal just a little bit because there is some diversity. I mean, you mentioned diversity. There's quite a bit of diversity in terms of pre-health advisors. So in terms of if you're a pre-med student, you need to figure out sort of how pre-health advising is structured and organized in your institution. So kind of a quick sort of simplified version, you can think of it as your institution either is going to have a centralized model. So you might see all the pre-health advising done typically like in a career center. It might be like an advising center, for example. So it's very centralized. Other places, it's going to be decentralized. It's all over the place. You'll have the biology department have a faculty who does some pre-med advising. In the chemistry department, you have another faculty doing advising. So it's very decentralized. And of course, there's always the third option, which is a little bit of both. So understanding sort of how that is structured, I think is something to take note of. Another big sort of thing that sort of is a structure by which pre-health advising is done is whether it's done by a faculty member. It doesn't matter whether it's tenure track or non-tenure track, but it's a faculty member who's doing the pre-med advising versus a professional staff advisor. And there's a difference. There's a difference in that the time commitment and the responsibilities of that role is different. I mean, if you're faculty, depending on obviously specifics of your contract and tenure track, but typically you're going to have other competing responsibilities of either research, publishing, and teaching as well. And somewhere in there, you're also going to do some advising. Now compare that to a professional staff advisor where they're not writing books, they're not writing papers and journals, but they're really focused specifically on students directly. So they're more of a practitioner. And so that's something that I think students should kind of keep a lookout for. What resources are available to you? Is it a faculty advisor? Is it a staff advisor? And knowing sort of the pros and cons and seeing if you can sort of supplement whatever's available to you with what you don't have. Because I mean, sometimes we would love for our colleges and universities to provide everything that you need, a full service A through
Yeah.
Z. But unfortunately, Deb, you know very well that that is not the reality. And so there are plenty of opportunities for students and private independent advisors to help students. So
Yeah, and I
going
think that's
back,
important
yeah.
because, right, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, June, but
No, go ahead.
the idea of understanding what role your pre-health advisor plays and what their background is, I think is important when you're in an undergraduate program or even during your gap year, because it's also important to know whether you can still engage them during your gap year. But I think it gives you a good sense of what their resources are. I think you do really need to be aware of that because that will sort of dictate how you engage with them. And as an independent advisor, as you know, and I also work with an institution as well, I do know that they're limited sometimes. They just don't have as many hours in the day to sort of proofread your personal statement 15 times, which is fine. And some do. So I think it's important to kind of know how your pre-health office engages with you, right? So that's going to vary from institution to institution. What do you think are key
And to,
things, though, that every pre-health advisor could really provide for a student?
I think pre-health advisors, just like any profession, we have to acknowledge that there's a great range, variance in sort of the quality and the ethics of the advisors, right? So That's one of the key functions and roles of our association for NAAHP, is to provide sort of that almost a baseline for the quality of advisors. So if you have a pre-health advisor that you're working with, you want to make sure that they're at least a member, at the least, of our association. And when you are part of our association, you're going to be attending regular conferences. So our association is a national association um, with 4 regional associations. So we have the Western region, we have the Southern region, we have the Central region, and then we have the Northeast. So these 4 regional associations are sort of a subdivision. They're independent associations, but the National Association, for whom I represent currently, yeah, our conferences are held every even number years, whereas the regional conferences are held odd number years. So theoretically, if you are a pre-health advisor and you have the time and you have the resources to attend every single conference, you're going to 1 conference in an even number year and 4 conferences in the odd number year, for a total of 5 conferences every 2 years. And so that is important, because that's where advisors go to get educated themselves. There's always changes, there's always updates. And so we know that when you're a pre-health advisor, um, it's one thing for you to know what you don't know, which is actually a good thing, because the last thing you want to do is work with a pre-health advisor who thinks they know what they're talking about, but they don't, right? And so this is where the professional associations are absolutely critical. You have to understand that through our pre-health advisors conferences is where the associations, right? These are like the AAMC, right? ADEA, ADEA for dental education. They work very closely with our association to ensure that the information our advisors share, our members share with their students, is accurate and up to date. So, so for example, like right now, situational judgment test is sort of the hot topic, right? And so pre-health advisors who were able to attend the conference and sit in on a session that AAMC presented on theirs is called the preview test, the situational judgment test. So how else would a pre-health advisor know these things other than maybe they're not aware of it, or if they are aware of it, it's basically what they read online, and it would be the same information that their students probably would have access to. But to be there in person, to hear the questions that colleagues in our association is asking, just an opportunity like any profession. You are going to be engaged with colleagues, and it really facilitates that sort of personal growth and challenging your practice. And it is a practice. You get better at it.
Yeah.
When we all start, we're very nervous because we don't know what to say, and until, I would say like a good year. And I'm super excited to share that our association has 2 sort of departments, if you will, 2 programs that's launching. It's the NAAHP Leads, or NAP Leads is how we refer to it, NAP Leads. And it is a program within our association to help prepare and develop leaders within our association. Because very often advisors, our members, are not aware how they can get involved. And so that is NAP Leads. We also have the second program that we're doing. It's called NAP Ed, like NAP Education. And so that program is definitely going to be critical for our association and for the rest of higher education, because not surprising, or maybe surprisingly, depending on who you talk to, there currently isn't a formal program or a onboarding or a job aid or training to become a pre-health advisor. It is very much sort of on the job, listen to what others are doing and just kind of follow along. So our association is really excited to more formally put together a program with specific courses, maybe topics, working with diverse student populations, how to advise students when we're talking about standardized exams. So there's a whole lot going on over there. So that's definitely
And
something
I
that you
love
want to.
that you brought up the conference and the session on the situational judgment test, because I know out of that came a whole conversation on the listserv, which is a way that a lot of advisors communicate with each other. And there's now a task force sort of from the pre-health advising standpoint, sort of looking at how situational judgment tests are affecting admissions for their students. So I find that fascinating because I think a lot of students don't realize their pre-health advisors at their colleges really are their advocates. So I think there's sort of this myth sometimes when they interact with their pre-health advisors that, you know, they're really discouraging sometimes or telling them not to apply, and they walk away from the office feeling a little bit discouraged. But ultimately, from the backside, what I see is that they're really huge advocates for the students in terms of making admissions more accessible, really trying to direct them or steer them in a way that's going to land them with a successful admission cycle. So, you know, I think the NAAHP plays a big role in creating that community of advocates for these students. And so, you know, you probably know this as well, but as an independent advisor, I always tell the students I'm working with, you still need to be engaging with your school's pre-health advisor. One, they write committee letters sometimes. So there's many things they do that advocate for them from an institutional place that I can't necessarily do as a pre-health advisor. There's data they have about how their students do. So they really have a wealth of information, institutional information that I think is important for students, wouldn't you say? And like, what else? So if you were going to tell students, what's the best use of your pre-health advisors, what would that be?
Right. Well, first of all, I mean, I think you just went straight to the core of the value of an institutional pre-health advisor, and that is you're in terms of building those important relationships so you can have those letters, right?
Right.
The advocacy. I mean, you had mentioned advocacy several times, and that is indeed true, at least of our membership and the members of NAAHP. The pre-health advisor in our association very much see their role as an advocate. And in fact, one of the ways that I would be able to figure out whether a pre-health advisor was a member of our association or not was to find out if they were operating, you know, very much with a advocacy, you know, sort of centered mind, or are they seeing their role as a gatekeeper? Because unfortunately, you know, I think we've all come across students where they said they spoke to an advisor,
They
and that
told them not
advisor
to
told
apply.
them
Yeah.
not to apply, change their major. You should look for another career path. They should not even think about medicine. It's just, yeah, it's disheartening to know that young people are being told that that is not the path for them. Now, you can certainly qualify by saying, listen, you know, right now, given your grades and how your performance is, it's going to be very difficult, very unlikely for you to be competitive right now. But here's the things that you can do to put yourself in a position where you can be more successful. I mean, that's a totally different way. And so this is why I love what you said about the advocacy. The pre-health advisors definitely that are members of our association approach their work really on the side of the students, always the student's best interest. And I think one of the real benefits of working with that pre-health advisor is that some of these programs are now asking for a letter from their institutional pre-health advisor. We've accustomed to two science faculty letters and one non-science faculty letter, but more and more, I am coming across programs where they're asking for, if you have a pre-health advisor, we want a letter from your pre-health advisor.
Interesting.
Which
Yeah.
yeah,
So you definitely
yeah,
want to build that relationship if it's there. I think there's lots of benefits. Again, you know, I think there's a few things to look for that we've sort of touched on because I don't want to use up too much of your time so we can sort of start closing up. But I think, you know, one thing we touched on is seeing how much institutional support there is for that pre-health office. That's more when you're choosing your undergraduate school. Once you're there, obviously, that's a little
correct.
trickier. But once you're
Yep,
there, knowing what the
right.
resources are available can also help you understand how
Yep,
to engage with that pre-health advisor, right? Like what can they do for you? What knowledge do they have? How much time do they have? What your expectations,
correct,
right? And
correct.
then, you know, I think the last piece I wanted to briefly touch on, well, two things. One is, if I understand correctly, NAAHP has resources for students whose schools don't even have advisors. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's called Find an Advisor. And so we have an army, a small army, but a growing army of pre-health advisors within our association that offer up their free time. They're volunteer advisors for students who do not have a pre-health advisor at their institution. And so if you go to our website, the NAAHP.org, it's just look for the find an advisor. And there are some disclaimers and some, kind of little bit of reading material there. And it's basically to remind the students that this is not looking for a full-time advisor for your personal needs. Think of it as sort of like the emergency room, urgent care. It's for triaging and kind of setting students and stabilizing them and their situation. But really, you need to look for more long-term support. Oftentimes, students are attending large public universities. They just don't know who that person is, and they just don't know how to get connected. So what our volunteer advisors will do is, because the world is a very small place, and the pre-health advising world is a very small place, that our volunteer advisor may shoot an email to your institution's pre-health advisor, say, hey, I got one of your students here, just to help you get on their radar. And so that is a cool service that we have available. We get students from all over the world. We actually get students who are from other countries who will ask about trying to get into a US medical school. Of course, we'll have our domestic students who don't have a pre-health advisor and just needs a little guidance on their next steps. So
I mean, I
that
think
is
that's an
true.
amazing resource, right? That people are willing to volunteer their time to do that. And sort of in closing, I just wanted to chit chat. You obviously in your role interact with a lot of pre-health advisors, and I'm just wondering, maybe what are the top 3 pet peeves of pre-health advisors without getting into the weeds? What do you think?
Yeah.
What do you hear from school advisors that they wish maybe students might do differently?
Well, I think, some of these things, I think the pre-health advisors, especially if they're starting off, are not truly understanding of where the students are coming from. For example, it's one thing if you're a pre-health advisor who yourself, is a physician, you have gone down that path. Don't understand if you've never been a pre-med yourself. I used to have a colleague that I had my office adjacent to. No knock to their area of study, because it was in the arts or humanities, I believe, didn't really fully understand sort of the psychology of a pre-med student getting a C in OChem.
Right.
And so I think for a pre-health pet peeve, I think I want to almost turn it around and say it's a student's pet peeve that the pre-health advisor doesn't fully understand. But to answer
Doesn't
your
understand their
specific
angst.
question.
Yes.
Correct. That too often pre-health students are just blown off. They're neurotic, they're type A's and so forth. And I just think that's a little, too premature. I mean, I think you got to get to know the students to figure out what, where they're coming from. But to answer your question directly, what are the 3 things? I would say students need to do their own preparation. Students need to spend time and try to figure things out on your own before you come in, right? So before you're meeting with the pre-health advisor, you want to have done your part. Because you have to understand pre-health advisors, the ratio these days, it can be amazingly favorable, like just coincidentally at my place at KGI. I have about, if it's my colleague, myself, and our 2 TAs, I mean, it's about 30 students per advisor, which is insanely favorable. But the typical University of California institution, for example, I mean, we're talking hundreds, if not 1,000 students per advisor. So I would say, number 1, students, do your homework, right? And then number 2, I would say for students, they should know that it takes time to develop a relationship. Because a couple of questions ago.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Right, you were talking about how can pre-health advisors help students. Well, not just letters, right, but then understanding that relationships take time. Human relationship, at least the meaningful ones, the real ones, take time. And unfortunately, I don't think students get that until it's too late. They're a senior, they're a junior. Oh my gosh, I need letters. Who am I going to go ask for? And it's very uncomfortable for the students too, because I know they've shared it with me. They said, I feel like I'm brown nosing. I'm going and groveling and begging. Well, that's because you have no relationship there.
Right.
If there was, you wouldn't feel that way. So please, please, students, understand human relationships take time, it takes effort, and it's unpredictable. You know, there are going to
And
be
on
some
that note,
people
I
you're just,
also feel like if they go to office hours and they get sort of an overview assessment that maybe they're not ready, I feel like they
Mhm.
automatically disengage at that point. And honestly, that is not the point to disengage. I feel like that's the point to engage because it's, the why. What can I do? Help me be
That's right.
ready, right? That's their job is to
That's
help me
right.
be ready, right? So,
That's right.
I kind of love that point because I do think you have to keep trying to engage. Although obviously sometimes when
Mhm.
there's a volume issue, there is accessibility issues, and that's a whole different story.
Of
But I will
course.
say a lot of advisors do a really good job of putting materials out there. And I know with this virtual world we've been doing with COVID, it's really hard for these students to just be online 24/7. But I'm amazed at some of the resources some of these college advisors put out there. And yeah, I feel like that speaks to your point number one. I think if the students took the time to look at the materials, that is their way to be able to scale their efforts, right? So if you look at those materials and then really read what they put out there and then show up to the office to finesse that stuff, then that's kind of the best use of their in-person time.
Exactly. Exactly. So those are the two. I think you said three. So the third one, what I would say is a pre-health advisor would want students to take ownership.
Yeah.
I think it's a little discouraging and it's difficult to work with a student where everything is someone else's fault or they attribute it to, well, I had a poor, chemistry professor. Well, I didn't take, the correct course. It's just at some point, in order for you to help the student has to take ownership, right? Because if they're saying that it is not within their control, then then why are we here? If you can't implement the change and it's coming from elsewhere, and so I think that's where pre-health advisors sometimes, you know, uh, I wouldn't I wouldn't say it's a pet peeve as much as it's something like maybe a wish list
A
kind of
wish
that
list. Yeah.
students, right, like where students, if students were to say, listen, can you please help me figure out how can I be better? And so imagine a pre-health advisor sort of identifying three things, but if you're working with a student who says, oh yeah, that one, that's this person, and that's not me, and then it's just kind of going one by one to say how those are something that is outside of their control. It really ties the hands of the advisor. It almost discourages the pre-health advisors. Like, then I don't understand how I could help you. And
Right.
so taking ownership is huge. I think this is where students will say things like, no, I don't think I prepared enough for the MCAT, right? Instead of saying this MCAT prep that they took wasn't very good,
Right.
right? They're just kind of almost outsourcing their success. Like,
The whole
no,
internal locus of control, right? Understanding, the things you have to take
yes, you
charge of.
went there. Absolutely.
Yes, which is
Absolutely.
great because that does speak to what we hope our gap year associates are doing during their gap year if they're working clinically, right? Once you're in a clinical setting, that is an incredibly important competency, right? You have to take responsibility.
Absolutely.
So why not start early?
Absolutely.
So
Yep.
June, as I love chatting with you, that meeting we had years ago was like pivotal in my pre-health advising career. And I'm so happy that you're president-elect of NAAHP. It sounds like there's so many great things coming down the pike for pre-health advisors. And I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Oh, thank you. Thank
And,
you. It's been
and I know
wonderful.
our
It's a
paths
lot of
will
fun.
continue to cross.
It sure will. It's a very small world. So
It's
I
a
look
very
forward to
small
it.
world, which is probably a good lesson for students to know as well. It's a very small world.
Yes.
All
Yes.
right,
Love
June.
people. All right.
Take care. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.